Springtime in Utah. Welcome to The Big Puzzle. In this podcast, we explore the subtle connections between science, religion, politics, economics, and history. One piece at a time, we unveil the big picture of this shared experience that we call life. We are in April already, and well, it's about to snow. So I think it's a good time to talk about meteorological weather models. And to do so, we can start by talking about one guy whose name is Edward Norton. It's not the actor, it's another Edward Norton. This is actually Edward Norton Lawrence. And he was a mathematician and also a meteorologist. And he was working in atmospheric models, right, to try to understand convection. So how does the temperature of the air moves up with heat and all those processes. And you know, the story says that he was working in one of these models, and it was kind of a complex model. It has 12 different interrelated variables. That was 1963, and he ran one of these models. For whatever reason, he then decided to repeat the same model, so to run it again. So to his surprise, when he ran the model the second time, he got completely different results. And well, that doesn't make any sense. If you run the same model, you know, you're not randomizing absolutely anything. Well, you should get to the same result. It's just math. But he didn't. So after looking at what would happen, he realized that some of the initial values for the variables were slightly different. So tiny differences. But he thought, well, that shouldn't make a completely different result, right? So it's such a small difference, so you're basically starting from a slightly different point. Why would you get to a completely different place? But yeah, that's what happened. So he repeated again, and he realized, oh yeah, that initial small change produced this big change in the model at the end. So to try to understand better how that happened, he started reducing the model. So simplifying it, taking some of those variables out, and he just kept 3 variables. Why 3 variables? Because with 3 variables you can pretty much plot in space where the model is. So those 3 variables are, you can say those are 3 coordinates, and you can kind of track what the model is doing through time. So he did that, and that's what we now know as the Lorentz equations. Now, when he did that, he noticed something very, very interesting. First of all, he realized that, well, he had seen, it's what's happened. So the model, first, if you start from a slightly different point, initially you won't see much of a difference, but then some big changes start happening. And those, grow more and more with the simulation. That led to what we now call the theory of chaos. And maybe you have heard about the butterfly effect. And the butterfly effect, one way to say is that, well, the butterfly flapping its wings in some place in the world can produce, a typhoon in Japan or something like that. Because of this, right? So these small things can produce big changes. What makes as chaos chaos is the opposite of order, right? It's also the opposite of control, but well, let's leave that for another discussion. But that means that it's very difficult, it's impossible to know what a system will be doing in the future, because small changes produce incredibly big effects. Right? So, interestingly enough, if you look at the shape that those variables follow with Lorentz equations, if you're looking from a certain point of view, it looks like a butterfly. So our curves look like the butterfly. So I probably put an image for that so you can see what I'm saying. But other things were interesting. He had different parameters that he can tweak and see how things behave, but there was some combination of those parameters that really led to some interesting discoveries. And one, for instance, had to do what we now call Lorentz strange attractor. So we're saying we're starting from some point, and then from that point the next point is calculated, and then the next point, and so on. So that point starts moving around following a path. In this attractor, those paths are never repeated. So you start in one point, and then it follows the path, and that path never crosses itself. So it's an infinite, it covers infinite places just by starting with one point. But if you start from one point to the side of that one, it will do the same, also following a path, but it's different than the first one. It doesn't cross with that one as well. So that's why it's so interesting. But the notion of attractor, why attractor? Well, because those paths, they don't go all over the place. They just are constrained within one part of that 3D space. So all those paths are moving, are infinite. They don't cross, but they're constrained. They're only happening in a certain region. And that region seems to be attracting those solutions, right? Those points. Very, very interesting stuff. Now, it's not only the issue of the different initial point where you start that defines where the particle will go, the point would go, but also these equations that we're talking about are particular equations that are called differential equations, right? And we can talk about that some other time, but basically establish strong relationships between those three variables, those three, coordinates, let's say. We have two ways to solve equations. One is what we call analytical, that basically is a pure mathematical way to represent, you can calculate any point that you want exactly. So those are exact analytical mathematical equations. But most of the time, and in I would say 99.9% of the practical needs, it's impossible to calculate those solutions, those equations, those analytical equations. So what we use is something that is second best, is what is called numerical method. With numerical methods, you have to choose a time step. So you say, okay, my point is here, and now I will calculate the next point after 2 milliseconds, right? So then you calculate after 2 milliseconds, and after other 2 milliseconds, and so on. So you choose your time step, and that defines where the next point will be. Well, the thing is, the solutions are very different depending on the time step that you use. So if you use 1 millisecond, it's different than if you choose 2 milliseconds, or 1 second, or 1 year. So that is something that will become relevant when we come to talk again about this universe and the problem that we have with infinity and continuous processes. But yeah, so those Lorentz equations are only possible to calculate them with numerical methods, so choosing a time step. And again, if you choose a slightly different time step, the path of the particle, of the point, it changes, but it changes dramatically, right? So that, I think, is something also to keep there for further exploration. If you want to go to a more artistic explanation, there's this cool story from Ray Bradbury that is called The Sound of Thunder, and tells a story about, well, I won't tell you can go and read it, but basically it's some time travelers that, if I recall correctly, they offer the service for people to go and hunt dinosaurs, but they had to be very careful, because if you affected the past in a significant way, well, the present will be different. So go and read it. It's really cool and explains this idea of tiny changes producing big differences, right? So talking about simulations, there are some things that now we need to do when we're running these models. You can just say, okay, I will run this model and this is the result that I get, because like we said, if you had started from a slightly different point, you would end up having a different result. So let's say I want to predict the temperature in 5 hours, right? So I would say, well, what is the temperature now? Well, if the temperature now is 4 degrees Celsius, I will start my calculation from there. And I would say, well, I recompute this every second for the next few hours to get that result. But, well, the funny thing, if I start with, instead of 4 degrees, from 4.01 degrees, I will get a different result. So it's not really very useful. All the models are kind of rendered useless if we consider this theory of chaos. It doesn't always happen, so sometimes values converge. So you can start from different places, but they go to the same place pretty much, but you don't know in advance. So what we do is two things. One is what is called a sensitivity analysis. Sensitivity analysis, what we do is we run the model with different values. We start with 3.9, 4, 4.1, 4.2, and we see what we get. And we see if the values converge or if they diverge. And that's what we know. If we make a change, put it this way, we'll make a change that is 10% in the input, what will be the difference in the output? If it's more than 10%, less than 10%, and so on. And the other one is what we call ensemble simulation. It is pretty much the same thing. So you randomly vary the initial variables slightly, and you run the model over and over with this random combination, with a random starting point, all very close together, but all of them different. And then you calculate some statistics at the end. So you could say, okay, if I start, this example I was saying, if I start with 4 degrees plus minus 0.1 and I run 100 simulations, then I end up having 20 degrees plus minus, so basically you will use probably standard deviation, something more statistically correct, but you say plus minus 5 degrees, right? So the ensemble simulations allow you to explore all the potential results and learn something, right, from that. And again, this will be relevant in the future when we talk about this universe. Let me give you a little hint. I think that is somehow related to quantum physics and is somehow related to free will. Let's leave it there. But also the other interesting thing that we mentioned is this idea of attractors. So even though you have different solutions and infinite paths around those solutions, for those solutions, they are limited, they are kind of attracted to a certain region. And when we talk about attraction, well, what's the opposite of attraction is repulsion. So let's talk a little about that. And for understanding this better, I think we need to connect to another thing, that is the concept of equilibrium. So we have, in general, 3 types of equilibrium. And we have a stable equilibrium, we have indifferent equilibrium, and we have an unstable equilibrium. So to illustrate these 3 types of equilibrium, equilibria, you think about having a ball and a bowl, right? So a bowl like for food. So if you put the bowl and then you put the ball inside, well, the ball will naturally go to the lowest point in the bowl. Sorry if my pronunciation of ball and bowl sounds similar. I really don't know the difference. I'm trying to, but I hope you understand. So naturally it will stay there. Now if you move that ball from the bottom, the ball will try to go back to the lowest point. If we ignore friction and drag and so on, you can move the ball out, and then when you let it go, it will start orbiting somehow around that lowest point. So the lowest point becomes the attractor and makes that equilibrium stable. It's attracted to that point. Now, what will be indifferent equilibrium? Well, instead of the ball, you just have a flat surface. So in the flat surface, if you put the ball, then it will stay where you put it. Right? If you move it, it will stay there. If you move it to that place, it will stay there. So that is indifferent. Right? The ball doesn't matter where it is. It's not moving. And what will be then the unstable equilibrium? Well, the unstable equilibrium is if you put the ball upside down and then you put the ball on top. If you are very, 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 very careful, the ball will remain there on the top of the bowl. But if there's a tiny change in the position, if you move it just slightly, that change will make the ball more and more, right? And basically will fall. So in that case, that higher point of the ball becomes a repulsor. You can keep it there, but you keep it there, you have to be constantly, putting some effort. You have to be monitoring it, and you have to, if you start moving this way, you have to push it in the other way. So that's why it's unstable. By itself, it won't remain there, but yeah, you can add external, forces or external stimuli to keep the ball on top of the ball. Okay? Now, if we think about this, we see this everywhere. You can analyze a big chunk of the world just by thinking in terms of equilibrium. We have then this idea of pooling. So a stable equilibrium requires an attractor that pulls, right? And then you have, in unstable equilibrium, you have a repulsor or anti-attractor that pushes away. And think about, for instance, the way you can herd sheep. So there's 2 ways that you can do it. You can push them, right? That's what, these herding dogs do, that they go around, when the sheep start going in the wrong direction, they go and they push them back. So that is, they produce an unstable equilibrium. Or you could have, I don't know, I'm not a shepherd, but from what I read, you could have shepherds that the sheep recognize, and they would follow. So if the shepherd calls them and they recognize his voice, and now we will get into the scripture later, they will just follow. So that's the attractor. You can either push them or you can pull them. It's easier to pull them. It requires way less energy. You can think about, in politics, you can think about socialism and capitalism. So socialism requires pushing. You need to be pushed all the time. In capitalism, well, there's an attractor that is capital, that is merit, that is, something that rewards you. It doesn't punish you, it rewards you. So that's again some other example. In engineering, we have this type of effects as well. So when we have a long column that has some force on top, maybe the material, let's say it's a steel pole or column, the material can receive a lot of compression from the force. But what happens is that at some point it starts bending, right? It's not straight anymore. When it becomes bending, you have one effect that is called the buckling effect. So the buckling effect means the same thing that happens with the ball, right? So the center of the column moves a little to the side because it's bending, and that makes that the force and the response of the column are not aligned, which produces let's say a torque that increases the bending and increases the difference. And so failure by buckling is one example of unstable equilibrium. How do you deal with that? Well, you probably would anchor that column in some places so won't allow them to move laterally. But also in human behavior, we have this idea of love and fear. So love attracts while fear repulses. So sometimes it's interesting because sometimes people, for instance, in very authoritarian countries, they think that they love somebody just because they didn't kill them already. So kind of saying that love and fear are relative to each other. But yeah, so it's you can dominate people by love or by fear, right? And another example would be, for instance, the idea of truth and lies. Truth is coherent. So one truth is connected to another truth, and then they support each other. But lies don't. So one problem that the liars have is to keep the lie alive. You need to add more and more and more lies until it's very, very difficult. That's why people who, analyze body language, they can tell when people are lying just because of the amount of effort that you need to put. And also polygraphs and things like that use that concept. It really stresses you to lie, especially when you're compounding lies, because you need to remember what you say, you need to come up with another lie that is consistent with the first one, and at some point it's impossible. So, well, don't lie, always say the truth. But let's go back to scripture, so the Bible. If we focus on the Old Testament and the law of Moses, it seems like God had to be pushing a lot, people around. They will read way more talking about fearing the Lord from the Israelites. While in the New Testament, well, Jesus changed the message more on the stable equilibrium. That is love. So basically he reduced all those complex laws that, some of them were given by God, some of them were added by, by their teachers, Pharisees and scribes and everyone. But he reduced it to 2 commandments, right? What we call the 2 big commandments. So to love God and to love your neighbor. So now it's about attracting. And why is it important to attract? Because when they're attractors, things self-organize. And that's a very, very important thing. If you think about the 4 forces in nature, as we understand it today, 3 of them, that would be gravity, that would be the strong nuclear force, and also electromagnetism. They have an attraction part, let's say. Electromagnetism also have the repulsion, right? Particles of the same pole, magnetic pole, or the same charge, they repel, but if they're opposite, they attract. Because the universe, to be organized, needs to have attractors. Right? The weak nuclear force is weird, so yeah, it's not really attractive or repulsive. But you can see how this universe is built around the idea of attractors. Societies are organized around some attractors that are common goals, common principles, common values. Protection comes from, organizing, attracting. So it's a very important concept. Now, a disclaimer, that doesn't mean that repulsion or push doesn't have a role. Like we were talking about selfishness in the past, so we can also say that in some cases you need to be pushed. For instance, if there's a fire in the building, you're not moving because of attraction. You're not saying, okay, what is the place that I would like to be? Right? You just go away from the fire. So the fire repulses you. But that only works, like with selfishness, in very short-term strategies, right? Short-term reactions. But if you want to build something, and you want to build something that is stable, that can grow, that is fulfilling, you need to have attractors. Okay, so yeah, I thought, again, this would be shorter, but I don't know, it's been a while since I gave you any homework, but I think this topic is good for homework. So look around you, see what attractors are around you, and see how can you become an attractor? How can you produce organization? How can you help this universe to be better? For you, for people around you, for everybody, for the environment. Become a source of organization. Okay, so, well, I think this is long enough. So I really hope to see you in the next one. Bye.